Many people interpreted Jon Hoover that he's saying Ibn Taymiyyah believes everything that exists, including God, can be experienced or perceived by all five senses. Okay, guys, I'm back with another video here. For some people, it may be exciting. For other people, it may not be that exciting. But anyway, this video here is going to detail the recent back and forth that I've had with Professor Jon Hoover related to his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, for people who don't know, I'm going to put in the description of this video my initial criticisms of Professor Jon Hoover's article on Ibn Taymiyyah. And in this video, this current video now, I'm going to detail his response or some of his responses to my video, my previous video critiquing his article, and some of my thoughts, basically summarizing what happened, the discussion between us that took place on Twitter or X. Okay, so for people who don't know, one of the main issues, and this is really what I'm going to stick to because, you know, going into the other issues, people can follow the Twitter threads if they want and see it on my Twitter account. But I'm just going to focus mainly on one issue because I don't want to make the video too long. Okay, so here, as you guys can see on the screen, the first main issue of dispute that we criticized, not only myself, but Abdurrahman and other people criticized Jon Hoover for, was his statement here regarding Ibn Taymiyyah's ontology, meaning what Ibn Taymiyyah believes exists and what are the conditions for something to exist. He wrote in his original article, all existence, including God, are concrete particulars, capable of being perceived, right, by the five senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Whatever cannot be perceived by the five senses does not exist. So there was some controversy over this passage on what is Jon Hoover saying here. Is he saying that according to Ibn Taymiyyah, anything that exists must be perceived by all five senses? Or does he mean that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that whatever exists must be perceived by at least one of the five senses, but not necessarily all of them? So I think that in either case, both views are not actually correct in representing Ibn Taymiyyah, and I gave reasons for why in the previous video, which I'm not going to go through now. Nevertheless, many people interpreted Jon Hoover, and that's why they were appalled that he's saying, wait, he's claiming that Ibn Taymiyyah believes everything that exists, including God, can be experienced or perceived by all five senses. So that would then entail that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can be tasted. Astaghfirullah. He not only doesn't believe that, he actually explicitly refutes that in several passages in his works. So that would have been definitely wrong. So in my video, I said, well, Jon Hoover couldn't possibly mean that because that's so absurd and ridiculous. I don't think he could actually mean that. I think he maybe means that Ibn Taymiyyah thinks that, you know, God and anything that exists can be perceived by at least one sense, one of the five outer senses. Now, I don't even think that is necessarily correct. Nevertheless, it's not as ridiculous as an assertion as the other view. Now, I no longer really believe that that's what Jon Hoover meant. I believe that he actually did mean that Ibn Taymiyyah thinks that anything that exists can be perceived, including God, by all five senses. And I'll give reasons for why I believe that in just a second after my dialogue with him. Let me show you guys now the Stanford Encyclopedia article where that same exact sentence Jon Hoover has edited, and not sneakily. I'm not saying that he did anything, you know, maliciously there, but he told me that he edited because of my concerns and my comments. So now it reads in a section on ontology, this is the current article, current version of the article, all existence, including God, are concrete particulars capable of being perceived by at least one of the five senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Whatever is not susceptible to perception by the senses does not exist. So notice the subtle change. he went from all existent things, including God, can be perceived by the five senses, to now he changed the language. Anything that exists, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, can be perceived by at least one of the five senses, not necessarily all of them. So he changed and he edited his article on that passage because of my criticism. Now, here are the reasons why I'm going to say that I don't believe that that was Jon Hoover's original intention. Because when I questioned him about this passage, here is what he gave as proof for his position. You'll see there, it says, Ibn Taymiyyah affirming that all existence are susceptible to outer sense perception. See my article, see my God spatially above article. And he says on page 649, footnote 80, right? So what is that referring to there? And you'll see my response to him in just a second. I'll show you what is on that page from the article that he was using to justify the controversial passage, the original controversial passage that I just read from. And this is from that article, right? This is on page 647. So reading from about the middle of the page here, he says, for Ibn Taymiyyah, this is Jon Hoover writing, every existent thing, whatever it may be, must be potentially accessible to the human senses to count as existent. And this includes God. While he does speak of existence known by the inner senses, he also indicates that everything is ultimately perceptible by the outer sense. So Jon Hoover makes a distinction between inner sense and outer sense for Ibn Taymiyyah, but he claims that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that anything that exists is perceptible to the human senses. So notice he doesn't use the language of at least one of the human senses, at least one of the five human outer senses. He leaves it general, and he says that every existent thing is ultimately perceptible to the outer senses, not at least one of the five senses, as the new edited version of the article says. Now, what's the proof that he gives for that? He gives a quote from Ibn Taymiyyah. Here's the quote here, which I'm going to read his translation. It says, opponents of the Jahmis affirm, meaning the Jahmiyyah. So those that refute the Jahmiyyah say that every existent, anything that exists, meaning, is perceptible by the five senses, not by at least one of the five senses, by the five senses, meaning anything that exists is perceptible by all five senses. They make follow necessarily from that. So what follows necessarily from that? That God is perceptible by the five senses of hearing, sight, smell, taste, and touch, and that whatever is not perceptible by the five senses is nothing but a non-existent. So those first two sentences is where Jon Hoover is making the claim that Ibn Taymiyyah is saying that his view is that anything that exists is susceptible to being perceived by the five senses. Now, notice that the language of the translation of the quote mirrors the first edition of his original comment in the SEP article on Ibn Taymiyyah. That leads me to believe that because he's using this to substantiate his claim in that section, that his original intention of what he said was that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that anything that exists can be perceived by all five senses. Because what he's attributing to Ibn Taymiyyah, even though I don't believe this is Ibn Taymiyyah's view, in the first two sentences, whoever holds that position believes that anything that exists is perceptible to all five senses. Because it doesn't say at least one of the five senses, it says the five senses. And then the second sentence makes it clear because it says they make follow necessarily from that, meaning the lazim of that qawl, the lazim, the entailment of that statement necessarily is that if anything that exists can be perceived by the five senses, that God himself is perceptible by the five senses. It doesn't say by at least one of the five senses. It says again by the five senses and then list them out explicitly. So there is no ambiguity. It says hearing, sight, smell, taste, and touch, and that whatever is not perceptible by the five senses, not by at least one of the five senses, by all the five senses, is nothing but a non-existent. Okay, so it's very clear those two sentences, whoever holds that view, that Ibn Taymiyyah is writing about believes that anything that exists can be perceived by all five senses. Therefore, if Jon Hoover was originally using this quote to substantiate his original claim in the SEP article, I believe his original intention was actually that Ibn Taymiyyah's position is that anything that exists can be perceived by all five senses. Then the quote carries on and says, the generality of the Salaf, meaning the pious predecessors, and those who affirm God's attributes maintain that God can be witnessed, seen, and sensed. The first to deny that he is perceptible by the senses was Jahm bin Safwan. That's why they're called the Jahmis or the Jahmiyyah. Now, another thing I want to point out here in this context of this quote is, my claim is that the first two sentences, whoever holds that view, is not Ibn Taymiyyah's view. He's quoting them and saying what they say, but he's not ascribing himself to that view. And this was mentioned to Jon Hoover. When this was mentioned to Jon Hoover, his response was, oh, but then in the second half of the quote, in the latter two sentences, Ibn Taymiyyah says, the generality of the Salaf and those who affirm God's attributes maintain that God can be witnessed, seen, and sensed. Yes, that is the view of the Salaf, that God can be seen. Why? Because we believe that God can be seen by the eyes in the akhirah, in the afterlife, right? But notice that when Ibn Taymiyyah says the view of the Salaf is that God can be witnessed, seen, and sensed. So he's just merely in that sense referring to and being specific, not general, that the view of the Salaf is that God can be seen, because he wants to affirm that we believe God can be seen in the afterlife. When the Jahmiyyah even deny that. They say that, yes, that he's not perceptible by the senses at all. I mean, none of the senses. He can't even be seen in the afterlife. So the first two sentences, Ibn Taymiyyah is telling you what some people who oppose the Jahmis said. Now, just because Ibn Taymiyyah opposes the Jahmis, that doesn't mean that he ascribes to that view. And just because he mentions the view of the Salaf later, doesn't mean that he's saying the first two sentences are the view of the Salaf. No, they're two different views. The first two sentences are a view of the group that opposes the Jahmis, that believes that anything that exists, including God, can be sensed by all five senses, not merely only one of them, or at least one of them, all five senses, and therefore that those people believe that God can be tasted. Astaghfirullah. Of course, Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't believe that, and of course he's not ascribing that view to the view of the Salaf. Therefore, that's not his view. Then he makes clear and says, but hold on a second. My view and the view of the Salaf is what? That God can be witnessed, seen, and sensed, meaning that he can be seen in the afterlife. That's mainly what he's referring to. Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't say anything about God being tasted. Astaghfirullah. Of course, he actually refutes that explicitly in other verses, or sorry, in other sections, in other texts in the same book, in the same text that Jon Hoover is quoting, right? So now let me just go back here to explaining. I just wanted to show you what Jon Hoover was referring to substantiate his claim. Now I'll show you what my response to Jon Hoover was when he gave that reference. I said, the reference you've mentioned to justify the claim that according to Ibn Taymiyyah, so IT just means Ibn Taymiyyah, anything that exists can be perceived by the five senses, seems to be the crux of the issue, and that's why I'm focusing on this in the video. One thing I find interesting is that the wording of the reference perfectly mirrors how you originally worded the article when you stated, quote, contrary to the dominant currents of post-classical Islamic thought, Ibn Taymiyyah's ontology is physicalist or materialist. I explained why that's not the case in the other video. Take a look at that. All existence, including God, are concrete particulars, capable of being perceived by the five senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Whatever cannot be perceived by the five senses does not exist. Close quote. That's from Hoover's article. The beginning half of the text you referenced in your article in the image below says that a certain group who opposed the Jahmis said that anything that exists can be perceived by all five senses, not merely at least one of the five senses. The next sentence explicitly states that this is the same group opposing the Jahmis, that God could be sensed by all 5 of the senses, including smell and taste. So your original wording in the SEP article is actually almost identical to the text you've mentioned here to justify the claim being made. With that being said, IT Ibn Taymiyyah then goes on in the second half of the quote to mention the view of the Salaf, which is that God specifically, not all existence, as the first half of the quote stated, can be witnessed, seen, and sensed. Here, Ibn Taymiyyah is merely affirming that Allah can be seen in the afterlife, which is the standard Sunni view. IT is not claiming that the first half of the quote is his view or the view of the Salaf. We know this because the first claim is extremely general, stating that all existence, including God, can be experienced by all 5 senses. On the other hand, Ibn Taymiyyah's view is in line with the Salaf that God, not all existence, can be seen. Ibn Taymiyyah does not affirm in the second half of the quote that we can smell and taste God. Astaghfirullah. Furthermore, Ibn Taymiyyah explicitly denies this in other passages, as I already mentioned. So there is really no question that the first half of the text is not the position of Ibn Taymiyyah. Also, if you'd like to argue that it is Ibn Taymiyyah's position, then as I've already mentioned, your original wording in the SEP article would be more accurate to the quote. In which case, you'd have to argue that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that everything that exists, including God, can be experienced by all 5 senses, not merely at least one of them. Alternatively, if you stick to the new wording of the SEP article, that Ibn Taymiyyah believes anything that exists can be experienced by merely at least one of the 5 senses, then the text in your article in the image below cannot be used to support the thesis, because that's not what it says. In other words, if you take this lesser controversial view, in a sense, then you can't use this text if you want to try to prove that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that lesser opinion, then you need to use a different text. In which case, if you do, then we'll respond and go back and forth on that. It says that one of the groups who opposed the Jahmis believed all existence, including God, could be perceived by all 5 senses. So you'd need a different text to justify the lesser claim that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that anything that exists can be experienced by at least one of the 5 outer senses. As far as I can tell, there are 2 options here at this point for Jon Hoover. One, you can defend the claim that Ibn Taymiyyah aligns himself with the view mentioned in the first half of the quote and argue he believes anything that exists can be perceived by all 5 senses, or you can attempt to defend the claim that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that anything that exists can be perceived by at least one of the 5 senses. To do so, you'd have to provide a reference for this claim other than the one in your article in the photo below. I believe that either option is problematic for the reasons already mentioned above. Option 1 is untenable from the context, as Ibn Taymiyyah isn't affirming the first half as his own view, and we have other texts from IT which explicitly refute this position. Option 2 is also untenable, as I'm not aware of any text that supports this view. And also, this text specifically can't be used to support that view because Ibn Taymiyyah is not ascribing himself to that view in that text. Secondly, it causes difficulties for his distinction between mental and extramental entities, and arguing that Ibn Taymiyyah believed universals are purely physical entities will be difficult to substantiate. Thank you for your engagement. I'm looking forward to your response. Okay, I hope that's clear enough. Now let me then go to Jon Hoover's response to what I just wrote there. Now, he said other things, but I just want to stick to what he says here about those first 2 lines, which are under dispute at this moment. He says, your reading of the first 2 lines is not fair to Ibn Taymiyyah's intention in the wider context of his argument against Fakhruddin al-Razi. The first 2 lines do not have to mean that anything that can be perceived by all 5 senses. Now, I think that that's completely ridiculous because that's obviously what it says, but then I'll show you what my response to him was here when I said just exactly that. I said, here, your translation of the first 2 sentences of the text, which I'm not disputing, meaning I'm not disputing. Here's your translation of the first 2 sentences of the text, which I'm not disputing. I mean, your translation is pretty much okay, but it just affirms my view and interpretation of the text, not yours at this point, Jon Hoover. And this is his translation of the text again. Opponents of the Jahmis affirm that every existent is perceptible to the five senses. They make follow necessarily from that. So what does that mean? That God is perceptible by the five senses, not at least one of them. And what? God is perceptible to what? Hearing, sight, smell, taste, and touch. It's very clear. And that whatever is not perceptible by the five senses is nothing but a non-existent. Not by at least one of the five senses, all five senses. So now I say, now, how could my reading of those first two sentences, with all due respect, Professor Hoover, be unfair when whoever holds the view expressed in the first two sentences believes that anything that exists, including God, can be perceived by all five senses, and they list them out? Are you claiming that the second sentence only implies that God is perceptible by at least one of the five senses, but not all of them? The people with this view don't believe that God can be tasted, even though that's explicitly what it says? That doesn't seem correct. Thanks again for your response. Okay, so then Jon Hoover responds to that. So I'm attempting to be fair here to show you what his responses are. He says, so I do not agree with your interpretation of the first two sentences of my translation. Ibn Taymiyyah is speaking of sense perception in general. Even if you have independent evidence, and then he goes on and carries on about why, if you have independent evidence about this particular group who he believes Ibn Taymiyyah is ascribing this view to, that even if you have independent evidence that they believe all anything that exists can be experienced by all five sentences, that's not what Ibn Taymiyyah is saying in this section here that he's quoting. Okay, so what's my response then to Jon Hoover, which I just responded to him now. He hasn't responded to yet from what I know. Now I'm responding to him. This is probably the last response, and I don't think he's going to respond again, which is fair enough. I said, sorry for the late response. I don't think your reading of the first two sentences of the paragraph is even remotely plausible for the reasons I've already said. It's quite clear from the Arabic and your translation that whoever holds the beliefs mentioned in the first two sentences believes that anything that exists can be experienced by all five senses, and not merely one of them. Also, I hope, at the very least, one can understand, including Jon Hoover, I hope that you understand, why your original statement in the Stanford article on this issue and your translation and representation of the passage in your other article about God's whatever spatial existence, linked above, can easily give one the impression that you are claiming that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that anything that exists can be experienced by all five senses, and not merely at least one of the five senses. Nevertheless, I appreciate your responses. I mentioned to him what I'm planning to do now, what I'm doing right now. I'm planning to make another video, and that's this video, summarizing our exchange here and relating it to the first video, especially given the change to the wording in the disputed passage. I'm just giving you the heads up. I will post it and tag you here when it's released. God willing, take care. Okay, so that's basically a summary of the key issue and disputed passage of what happened. So now let me summarize and explain to the audience what I think happened. I think that Jon Hoover, in his original statement in the SEP article, was claiming, and his intention was, that Ibn Taymiyyah believed that anything that exists can be experienced by all five senses. The reason why I now believe that is based on his response that the passage he's using to justify it is the passage which almost identically mirrors his words in English and what he said in his translation in that God spatially located or whatever Brill article. And in that passage, it's explicit that he's saying there, and that whoever holds that view in that passage, he gives almost the same wording, believes that whatever exists can be experienced by all five senses, including God, that God can be tasted. Astaghfirullah. So I do believe that that was Hoover's initial intention with the SEP article. So for the people who told me that, I was wrong, and I think you guys were right. Then what I think happened is, due to my criticism and maybe the criticism of others, Jon Hoover maybe realized that that was wrong, so he modified the text to say at least one of the five senses and not necessarily all of them. Now, I still think that that's wrong because I still believe that Ibn Taymiyyah believes there are things that exist which are not purely physical, which are mental entities like universals and other things, which I mentioned in the previous video, and I gave reasons for thinking that. But that's not really the main issue at this point. Then the problem that Jon Hoover wound up in, because I think he genuinely changed his position and then changed his wording because of it, because he realized that it was incorrect, he tried to use the same text to substantiate his original position, but now there's a incompatibility because that passage cannot be used to substantiate that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that anything that exists can be experienced by at least one of the five senses, because that passage says whoever holds that view believes that whatever exists can be experienced by all five senses. So even if that is Ibn Taymiyyah's view, you can no longer use that same passage to substantiate that lesser view. So now what we need from Jon Hoover is a new text other than that one to attempt to substantiate that view, and then we can engage with that, and the conversation can progress. But I believe that Jon Hoover's original intention was that God and anything that exists can be experienced by all five senses. He realized that was incorrect. He changed the wording, but then tried to use the same text to substantiate it, and that's the problem that he finds himself in now. So he has to use a different text to substantiate that position, and he should retract and admit and say clearly that the first two sentences, whoever holds that view, which is very clear from the text, which I don't believe Ibn Taymiyyah even ascribes himself to holding the view of whatever is said in the first two sentences, and I gave reasons contextually for why that is. Whoever holds that view believes that God and anything that exists can be experienced by all five senses, and therefore Jon Hoover, in light of his new position and change, shouldn't use that text to attempt to prove that Ibn Taymiyyah or anyone else who holds that view believes that anything that exists can be experienced by only one of the five senses, because that's not what the text is saying. So I don't believe that Ibn Taymiyyah holds that view of the first two sentences, whatever you interpret it as, and I believe that a clear interpretation of those first two sentences is that whoever holds that view believes that God can experience by all five senses. Jon Hoover does not believe that that's Ibn Taymiyyah's view. Therefore, he should not be trying to use that text to substantiate his new lesser opinion that he's changed in the SEP article. With that being said, guys, I still have no ill will for Jon Hoover. I hope that this summary makes sense. I welcome his response if he wants to respond further. If he doesn't, that's also fine. I hope that for people who are interested, you guys found this video educational. I thought his response deserved a further breakdown. If you did like this video, consider liking it, subscribing to the channel, and turning the notification bell on so you get notified of future videos. Also, comment and let me know your thoughts if you agree with my analysis of the conversation with Jon Hoover. And if you guys want to go above and beyond and support the channel, then the best way to do so is at the GoFundMe link, which is pinned at the top of the description of this video, as well as my other videos. With that being said, guys, until next time, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.